When the HOA president boxed in his ranch and locked the gate, most people expected him to cave. Instead, Anthony Ridley turned the tables with one move they never saw coming. Anthony Ridley had seen storms tear down fences before, but never one like this. This one wasn't made of wood or wire. It was made of rules, arrogance, and a padlock he didn't own. One morning in early March, just as the sun lit the rolling pastures outside Abilene, he walked out with a mug of coffee and froze. A brand new gleaming perimeter fence stretched across his property line. It wasn't his. It wasn't even on his land. And at the center of it, the only way in or out was a steel gate with a heavy lock and a sign. Property access managed by the Lakeside Meadows Homeowners Association. He set his mug down on the porch rail, staring. His cattle grazed inside, but now they were penned in like zoo animals. The old access road, the one that led to the county highway, was on the other side of that gate. The only key belonged to the HOA president, Marjorie Kane, a woman with sharp suits, sharper heels, and an even sharper reputation in the neighborhood. Anthony had moved here just 6 weeks earlier, leaving behind the traffic and noise of Amarillo. 46 years old, with calloused hands and a back that still ached from the last calving season, he'd saved for years to buy this spread. He'd imagined peaceful mornings, the steady rhythm of ranch work, and the sound of cattle lowing against the wind. He hadn't counted on a homeowners association, let alone one that would literally fence him in. By the time he reached the gate, 2 men in HOA polo shirts were tightening the bolts. "Morning," Anthony called, trying to keep his tone even. "Mind telling me what this is?" One of them didn't look up. The other muttered, "Talk to the board." And then he saw her, Marjorie Kane, pulling up in a spotless silver SUV. She stepped out, sunglasses perched high, clipboard under her arm. "Mr. Ridley," she said without so much as a greeting, "you've been notified of your non-compliance issues." Anthony frowned. "Non-compliance with what?" "Perimeter fencing must match community standards. Yours does not. Until it's corrected, this measure will prevent further violations." "This measure?" Anthony gestured toward the cattle milling near the fence. "That's my access road. My animals need water from the creek down there. And that," he pointed, "isn't your land." Marjorie's smile was thin. "The access easement is controlled by the HOA, Mr. Ridley. It's in the covenant you agreed to when you purchased the property." Anthony felt his stomach tighten. He remembered the stack of papers he'd signed at closing, pages of legal language no one but a lawyer could love. "You mean to tell me you can just lock me in?" "Until you comply," she said simply, turning toward her SUV. "Contact our office when you're ready to discuss the approved fencing style. Have a pleasant day." The gate clanged shut, the lock clicked, and she drove off. The 2 workers finished their task and left without another word. Anthony stood there for a long moment, hands on his hips, the morning breeze tugging at his shirt. He'd dealt with stubborn cattle, drought, and rising feed prices, but never someone so determined to make a point. That night, he sat at the kitchen table with his neighbor, Glenn Porter, a retired trucker who'd lived here 20 years. "They've been doing this for a while. Marjorie's got the board wrapped around her finger. If she doesn't like you, she'll make your life miserable." Anthony shook his head. "I didn't move out here to get pushed around by a committee." "Then you better be ready for a fight," Glenn replied. "She won't back down, and she sure as hell won't give you that key unless you play her game." Anthony leaned back, staring at the ceiling. He wasn't sure yet how far this would go, but something in him refused to give in. The land wasn't just dirt and grass. It was his dream, his work, and his future. The next morning he drove into town, bought a thick file folder, and started collecting every letter, every photo, and every scrap of paper related to the property. If Marjorie wanted a fight, he'd get one. But he had no idea just how personal and how public it was about to become. 2 days later, Anthony found himself walking into the Lakeside Meadows clubhouse for his first official HOA meeting. The place smelled faintly of fresh coffee and old carpet, and every seat in the small conference room was taken. Half a dozen board members sat behind a long folding table, papers stacked in front of them. At the center, wearing a tailored navy blazer and a necklace that looked like it cost more than his first truck, sat Marjorie Kane. Her eyes followed him as he took a seat in the back. "Mr. Ridley," she said into the microphone before the meeting even started, "you'll be on the agenda under compliance matters." The first 40 minutes were a blur of talk about landscaping, pool hours, and a dispute over someone's mailbox color. Anthony kept his focus on the packet they had given him. Page after page listed rules about exterior paint, driveway length, even acceptable lawn ornaments. When his name was finally called, he walked to the front, the sound of his boots echoing in the otherwise still room. "Let's talk about that fence you built," Marjorie began. Anthony took a slow breath. "It's the same one I've had for years on my previous property. It's functional, safe, and keeps my cattle in." "Functional isn't the standard here," she replied smoothly. "Community aesthetics are. Perimeter fencing must be uniform, and yours does not meet approved specifications." Anthony set his folder on the table and opened it. "This is a cattle ranch, not a golf course. My fencing is made for livestock, not to look pretty from the road." A man at the far end of the table cleared his throat. "Rules are rules, sir. We can't make exceptions. If we did it for you, we'd have to do it for everyone." Anthony met his eyes. "You already make exceptions. I drove past 3 houses on my street with different fencing styles. None of them match yours, and none of them have a padlock on their gate." A few people in the audience shifted in their seats. Marjorie's lips tightened. "Those cases are under review. In the meantime, you remain out of compliance. The fines will continue until the fencing is corrected." Anthony leaned forward slightly. "How about the fact that your fence is blocking access to my water source? You're interfering with my ability to care for my animals. That's not just wrong, it's dangerous. You have other water sources. We confirmed it with satellite imagery." Anthony let out a short, humorless laugh. "Imagery. You think you can tell from a photo how I run my ranch?" A murmur rippled through the room. Glenn Porter, sitting in the second row, raised his hand. "Marjorie, the man has been here barely 2 months. Maybe we give him time to adjust before hitting him with a locked gate and fines." Marjorie didn't even glance at him. "The HOA has to maintain standards, Mr. Porter. If Mr. Ridley wants to be part of this community, he must follow the same rules as everyone else." Anthony picked up his folder. "And if I don't?" Her voice stayed calm, but her eyes were sharp. "Then we continue with fines and, if necessary, legal action." He walked back to his seat without another word, though inside his frustration was boiling. After the meeting, several neighbors came up to him. Some whispered quick words of support before glancing nervously toward Marjorie. Others avoided eye contact altogether. It was clear she had influence here, maybe more than the title of president alone explained. Outside in the parking lot, Glenn caught up to him. "She's not just strict," he said in a low voice. "She's got the board wrapped around her finger. If she doesn't like you, she'll make your life miserable." Anthony shook his head. "I didn't move out here to get pushed around by a committee." "Then you better be ready for a fight," Glenn replied. "She won't back down, and she sure as hell won't give you that key unless you play her game." Anthony leaned back, staring at the ceiling. He wasn't sure yet how far this would go, but something in him refused to give in. The land wasn't just dirt and glass. It was his dream, his work, and his future. The next morning he drove into town, bought a thick file folder, and started collecting every letter, every photo, and every scrap of paper related to the property. If Marjorie wanted a fight, he'd get one. But he had no idea just how personal and how public it was about to become. 2 days later, Anthony found himself walking into the Lakeside Meadows clubhouse for his first official HOA meeting. The place smelled faintly of fresh coffee and old carpet, and every seat in the small conference room was taken. Half a dozen board members sat behind a long folding table, papers stacked in front of them. At the center, wearing a tailored navy blazer and a necklace that looked like it cost more than his first truck, sat Marjorie Kane. Her eyes followed him as he took a seat in the back. "Mr. Ridley," she said into the microphone before the meeting even started, "you'll be on the agenda under compliance matters." The first 40 minutes were a blur of talk about landscaping, pool hours, and a dispute over someone's mailbox color. Anthony kept his focus on the packet they had given him. Page after page listed rules about exterior paint, driveway length, even acceptable lawn ornaments. When his name was finally called, he walked to the front, the sound of his boots echoing in the otherwise still room. "Let's talk about that fence you built," Marjorie began. Anthony took a slow breath. "It's the same one I've had for years on my previous property. It's functional, safe, and keeps my cattle in." "Functional isn't the standard here," she replied smoothly. "Community aesthetics are. Perimeter fencing must be uniform, and yours does not meet approved specifications." Anthony set his folder on the table and opened it. "This is a cattle ranch, not a golf course. My fencing is made for livestock, not to look pretty."
Same. Cold, efficient, and backed by the threat of escalation. Afterward, in the parking lot, Paula walked up to him. "You're Ridley, right? The rancher with the fence issue?" "That's me," Anthony said. "They're going to run you down until you either give up or move out," she warned. "Marjorie's been doing this for years. She doesn't care who you are. She cares about winning." Anthony studied her face. "Why do people let her keep winning?" Paula's answer was quiet. "Because most folks don't want trouble, and Marjorie knows how to make trouble feel expensive." The conversation stayed with him. He realized the HOA wasn't just enforcing rules, it was building a culture where fear kept everyone in line. And now, by refusing to bow, he was drawing a line of his own. The next day, Anthony called the HOA office. "I'm requesting mediation," he told the woman who answered. "I want to sit down with the board and work out a compromise." When the mediation day came, he walked into the room with photographs of his cattle, maps of the property, and documentation of every conversation so far. Marjorie sat across the table, flipping through a thin binder, as if she already knew the outcome. "Mr. Ridley," the mediator began, "the HOA is willing to waive some of the fines if you agree to replace your fence within 60 days. Anthony shook his head. "That's not a compromise. That's just your original demand with a discount." Marjorie interjected. "We're being generous here, Mr. Ridley. Most people don't get this kind of consideration." Anthony leaned forward. "Most people don't have their animals trapped behind a locked gate either. This isn't just about a fence. It's about my livelihood, and you're standing in the way of it." The mediator shifted uncomfortably. "Let's focus on the practical options." "The practical option," Anthony cut in, "is you give me back access to my own road and stop pretending you're doing me a favor." Marjorie's smile didn't reach her eyes. "We'll be in touch," she said, standing to leave. The meeting ended without resolution. That night, Anthony sat on his porch long after the sun had gone down, listening to the distant calls of his cattle. The line had been drawn, and neither side was going to cross it willingly. But he didn't know yet that the fight was about to shift from quiet paperwork to something far more public and far more dangerous. The real breaking point came on a windy Thursday morning. Anthony had been up since dawn fixing a trough pump near the north pasture. As he walked toward the creek, he noticed his cattle clustered near the new perimeter fence, restless and pacing. He followed their gaze and saw the problem. The creek was now completely inaccessible. The new fencing didn't just block the road, it cut off the only reliable water source on that side of the property. He dropped his gloves on the ground and climbed over the fence, his boots thudding against the packed dirt on the other side. The locked gate stood like a challenge in front of him in the morning light. He rattled it hard, the sound echoing across the pasture. No movement, no one to answer. By mid-morning, he was on the phone with the HOA office again. "I need access to that creek immediately," he told the receptionist. "My cattle can't be cut off from water. This is basic animal welfare." Her tone was clipped. "Mr. Ridley, the HOA has confirmed there are other water points on your property. Those tanks are for backup. If we hit a heat wave, they won't last a week. Do you want to be responsible for dead cattle? I can forward your concern to the board, but I can't authorize access." That afternoon, Anthony drove straight to Marjorie's house. Her place was immaculate. Freshly painted siding, trimmed hedges, not a leaf out of place. She opened the door, wearing a pale blue blouse, her expression polite but guarded. "This isn't about fines anymore," Anthony said, keeping his voice steady. "It's about my animals. You're cutting them off from water." Marjorie's reply was smooth, almost rehearsed. "Mr. Ridley, the HOA operates under a uniform standard. If we make exceptions, it undermines the integrity of the community." "The integrity of the community?" His voice rose. "You're talking about a fence. I'm talking about living creatures depending on me to keep them alive." Her expression didn't change. "The rules are the rules." Anthony took a step back, clenching his fist to keep from saying something he'd regret. "This isn't over, Marjorie." As he walked away, he caught a glimpse of movement behind her curtains, neighbors peeking out, watching. The fight was no longer just between him and the HOA president. It was a spectacle. 2 days later, the first signs of stress appeared in his herd. A few cattle stood near the fence, bellowing toward the creek. Anthony brought in extra water tanks, but the process of hauling and refilling them was exhausting and expensive. Glenn came over to help one afternoon, leaning against the truck as they unloaded another tank. "She's playing hardball, trying to wear you down until you give in," Glenn said. "I'm not getting what she wants," Anthony replied, pulling a wrench from the toolbox. "I'll keep hauling water if I have to, but I'm not rebuilding that fence just to match her idea of aesthetics." Still, the stress was building. By the end of the week, Anthony was running on little sleep, juggling ranch work with constant letters and notices from the HOA. One envelope included a photo. Someone had taken it from the road showing one of his cattle slightly tilted. The letter claimed it was a safety hazard and demanded its removal. "That's harassment," Glenn said after reading it. "That's Marjorie," Anthony replied. And then one morning, the situation shifted. A for sale sign appeared on the small half-acre lot that contained the locked gate. The land was technically separate from both his ranch and the HOA's main holdings. Anthony stood there staring at the sign, the gears in his mind turning fast. If I owned that strip of land, I'd own the gate. And if I owned the gate, the lock would be mine. But he knew if Marjorie caught wind of my plan, she'd find a way to stop it. So whatever he did next would have to be fast and quiet. Anthony didn't rush straight to the real estate office. He knew better than to charge in without understanding the full picture. That afternoon he drove into Abilene and sat down with Tom Baird, a local attorney whose office smelled faintly of old paper and fresh coffee. Tom had the kind of handshake that told you he'd been in business a long time. Anthony spread out the letters, photos, and the latest HOA notices on his desk. "I want to know if what they're doing is even legal, and if I buy the land with that gate on it, does it give me full control?" Tom adjusted his glasses, scanning the documents. "They're operating inside the bounds of the covenants you signed when you bought the property. That's the bad news. Those rules were baked into the purchase agreement, and they give the HOA more control than most folks realize." "And the good news?" Anthony asked. Tom tapped the photo of the for sale sign. "If that parcel really is separate from HOA ownership, and it's got the only gate access to your property, then yes, you'd have every legal right to control it. But you'll need to verify that before making a move, and you'll need to make the purchase in a way that doesn't trigger alarm bells at the HOA office." Anthony nodded. meaning Marjorie can't know it's me." "Exactly," Tom said. "If she catches wind, she could push the seller to accept a competing offer or find a way to rezone before the sale closes. You need to keep your name out of it entirely." For the next few days, Anthony kept up his normal routine as if nothing had changed. He fed the cattle, hauled water, waved at neighbors. But at night, he sat at his kitchen table drafting a plan. He contacted an old friend from college, Brett Lawson, who ran a property management company 2 counties over. Brett agreed to set up an LLC under his company's umbrella, giving Anthony total privacy in the transaction. One evening, Glenn stopped by and found Anthony studying a county plat map. "You're cooking something up," Glenn said with a grin. Anthony didn't deny it. "If I told you, I'd have to make you swear it stays between us." Glenn raised a hand. "My lips are sealed." Anthony explained the plan in low tones. By the time he finished, Glenn was grinning even wider. "That's bold, and I like it." Meanwhile, Marjorie seemed to sense something was shifting. She started showing up near the fence more often, sometimes with 2 other board members in tow. They'd stand by the gate, talking quietly, glancing in Anthony's direction. One afternoon, as he was repairing a post near the main pasture, she walked over with her usual clipboard. "Mr. Ridley, we've scheduled another compliance inspection for next week." Anthony didn't look up from his work. "You can schedule all you want. My fence isn't changing." "You're only making things harder on yourself," she replied. He straightened and met her gaze. "And you're underestimating me?" They stared at each other for a moment before she turned and walked back toward her SUV. The next morning, Anthony's phone buzzed.
She wasn't. But keeping a secret in a small community is like holding water in your hands, and Anthony was about to find out just how fast word could spread. 2 days after Brett's call, Anthony drove past the lot with the gate just to make sure the for sale sign was still planted in the ground. It was. A gust of wind had bent one corner, but otherwise nothing had changed. He parked down the road and sat for a while, watching. The property was small, just enough to hold the gate, a narrow gravel strip, and a thin line of mesquite trees along the back. But it was the choke point for everything beyond it. Whoever controlled this strip controlled every vehicle, every delivery, and every person entering his ranch. Anthony knew the HOA would have been on it already if they had the funds or the legal claim to grab it. The fact that they hadn't meant there was a gap, one he could quietly slide through. That afternoon, Brett called again. Title search came back clean. No liens, no disputes. Seller's just looking to unload it quick. Probably doesn't even realize the leverage it gives. Anthony smiled to himself. Good. Let's keep it that way. The next week, he kept a careful routine. No sudden visits to town, no unusual conversations with neighbors. If anyone asked about the fence situation, he just shrugged and said, "We'll see how it plays out." Inside, though, his mind was already running through what it would feel like to slide his own key into that padlock and turn it. One evening, Glenn came over with a cooler of beer and leaned against the porch railing. "You've been awfully quiet lately," he said. "That's either good news or you're planning something dangerous." Anthony handed him a beer. "Let's just say I'm lining things up so I don't have to ask for permission anymore." Glenn grinned. "Now that sounds like the Anthony I know." The hardest part was resisting the urge to tip his hand when he saw Marjorie. Twice that week, she drove past while Anthony was out by the road. She gave her usual curt wave, more of a motion than a greeting, and he kept his face unreadable. But inside the HOA office, things were shifting. Paula Green, the neighborhood warned Anthony about Marjorie's tactics, caught him in the grocery store one morning. "I heard the board's been sniffing around that gate lot," she said quietly, glancing around the aisle. "Don't know what they're planning, but they're talking to a surveyor." Anthony kept his voice calm. "Appreciate the heads up." That night, he called Brett. "We need to move faster. If they start bringing in surveyors, they could slow the sale or try to tie it up in court." Brett didn't hesitate. "I'll push the title company. We can get you an escrow by Friday." The days between felt like a slow boil. Anthony went about his chores, but every creak of tires on gravel had him glancing toward the road.
The thought of Marjorie swooping in at the last minute gnawed at him. On Friday morning, Brett called again. "It's done. Escrow's open, deposits down. We're locked in unless you back out. And I know you're not backing out." Anthony let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Let's get it closed as soon as possible. He didn't celebrate that night. Instead, he sat at the kitchen table, pen in hand, making a list of every scenario he could think of once he had the gate. There was no doubt in his mind that Marjorie would push back hard. She might call the sheriff, threaten lawsuits, even rally the board to write new rules. But none of that mattered if the legal ownership was his. Still, the victory wouldn't mean much if the HOA found another way to corner him. He'd need to be ready, not just for the fight, but for the fallout. But even with all his planning, Anthony couldn't predict how fast the tension would spike once the sale became public, and how quickly lines in the community would be redrawn. The closing date landed on a gray Tuesday morning, the kind where the sky felt heavy but refused to give rain. Anthony dressed like it was any other day. Worn jeans, boots dusty from the pasture, a plain button-up shirt. He drove into Abilene without telling a soul, parking behind the title company's small brick office. Brett was already inside sipping coffee and flipping through the paperwork. "Morning," Brett said with a grin. "Ready to make Marjorie's life a whole lot more complicated?" Anthony smirked. "Let's get it done." The process was straightforward. Because the LLC was listed as the buyer, Anthony's name never touched the official sale documents. Brett signed on behalf of the company, slid the papers across the desk, and within an hour, the deal was sealed. The keys, a single heavy silver set on a worn leather fob, sat in the center of the table. Brett pushed them toward Anthony. "They're yours." Anthony picked them up, turning the largest one in his hand. He could feel the weight of it. Not just metal, but leverage. For months, Marjorie had dictated when and how he could access his own land. Now, with one twist of this key, all that power shifted. They left through the back door, careful not to draw attention. Brett clapped him on the shoulder. "Congratulations, you just bought yourself a gate and a fight." Back at the ranch, Anthony parked by the road and walked the last 50 yards to the lot. The gate stood there, the same as always, but it looked different now. It was no longer an obstacle. It was his. He slid the key into the padlock. It turned smoothly, and the shackle popped open. The sound was sharper than he expected. Final, almost like a door closing behind him. He swung the gate wide and stepped back, letting the cattle in the nearest pasture wander toward the creek. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of control returning. That feeling lasted exactly 2 days. On the third morning, a white SUV pulled up and stopped in front of the gate. Marjorie stepped out, heels clicking on the gravel, clipboard in hand. 2 other board members got out as well. "Mr. Ridley, you appear to have accessed HOA property without authorization." Anthony leaned on the gate. "This isn't HOA property anymore. I own this lot. You can check the county records if you don't believe me." Her eyes narrowed. "That's impossible. The association had first right of refusal." "Maybe they did, but they didn't use it. The seller took my offer. Now this gate is mine, and I've got the paperwork to prove it." One of the board members shifted uncomfortably. "Marjorie, if that's true," she cut him off. "We'll see about that." Turning back to Anthony, she added, "Don't think for a second this is over. We'll challenge it." Anthony didn't flinch. "Challenge whatever you want. In the meantime, you don't control this access anymore. I do." They left without another word, but Anthony could feel the tension in the air. By that afternoon, he'd received 3 separate emails from the HOA demanding immediate clarification of the gate's status. He forwarded each one to Tom, who replied simply, "Let them make the next move." Over the next week, word spread fast. Neighbors he barely knew stopped him at the feed store or waved him down on the road. Some congratulated him quietly, like they didn't want anyone else to hear. Others warned him that the board was looking for ways to make an example out of him. Glenn stopped by one evening and found Anthony sitting on the porch, boots propped on the rail. "Looks like you lit a fire," Glenn said. Anthony took a sip of his coffee. "Good. Maybe it's time this place stopped being afraid of Marjorie." But what Anthony didn't realize was that taking control of the gate was just the first round. The real fight was about to get ugly, and it would drag the entire neighborhood into the middle of it. It didn't take long for the HOA to go on the offensive. 2 days after Marjorie's visit to the gate, Anthony received a certified letter claiming that his ownership of the lot may constitute an encroachment on association rights and demanding that he cease any alteration to the property until a legal review is completed. He walked the letter over to Glenn's place that evening. Glenn read it, then laughed out loud. They're bluffing. If they thought they had a real claim, they'd already be in court. Anthony shrugged. Bluff or not, they're not backing down. The tension reached a new level that Saturday. Anthony was hauling a load of feed into the ranch when he saw Marjorie standing at the gate with 2 uniformed sheriff's deputies. The blue and gold decals on their trucks glinted in the sunlight. As Anthony slowed his truck and rolled down the window, one deputy stepped forward. "Mr. Ridley, we got a call about a property dispute. We're here to keep the peace." Anthony climbed out, holding his paperwork in one hand. "Deputies, this is my land. This lot, this gate, it's all on the deed. Bought it fair and square." Marjorie crossed her arms. "That property has always been under HOA management. He's interfering with community access." Anthony handed one of the deputies a copy of the recorded deed. The deputy looked it over, nodding slowly. "It checks out. He owns it." Marjorie's jaw tightened. "We'll take this to court." "That's your right, ma'am, but for now, there's no law being broken here." They left soon after, but the scene had drawn a small crowd of neighbors. I could hear snippets of conversation, some in support, others siding with Marjorie. The division was becoming impossible to ignore. That night, Anthony's phone buzzed with a text from Paula Green. "Be careful, they're holding an emergency board meeting Monday. Word is they're pushing for new rules that could hit you hard." Monday came and Anthony showed up to the meeting early. The room was packed, tension thick enough to taste. Marjorie wasted no time. "As many of you know, recent events have highlighted gaps in our ability to
Maintain community standards. The board is proposing an amendment granting the HOA authority over any access points that serve more than one property." Anthony raised his hand. "That's a pretty convenient amendment, considering you're targeting one specific owner, me." "This isn't about you, Mr. Ridley," she replied, though her eyes didn't leave his. "It's about the community as a whole." The back and forth was sharp and heated. Anthony pointed out that the amendment would give the HOA sweeping powers over land it didn't own. Marjorie countered with vague claims about security and consistency. When the vote was called, the board split, 3 in favor, 2 against, but the amendment still needed a majority of homeowner votes to pass. After the meeting, several neighbors pulled Anthony aside. One, a wiry man named Frank Delgado, spoke in a low voice. "You're not the first person she's tried to steamroll, but you might be the first who can beat her. Keep going." By midweek, the fight had spilled onto social media. A local community page lit up with posts about the gate, the HOA, and whether Marjorie had gone too far. Anthony kept his own posts measured, sticking to facts and sharing copies of public records. But the comments sections told the real story. Neighbors were picking sides like it was a small-town election. Then came the strangest twist yet. Glenn showed up one evening holding a plain envelope. Inside was an anonymous note. "Check the county clerk's filings tomorrow." Anthony did just that. What he found made his stomach drop. Marjorie had filed a notice of intent to purchase an adjacent strip of land that ran alongside his fence. If she got it, she could create an alternate access route and cut his leverage in half. But if she thought that would scare him, she was about to learn that Anthony had no intention of giving up an inch, not after coming this far. The day after Anthony learned about Marjorie's filing, he headed straight to Tom Baird's office. The lawyer was leaning back in his chair when Anthony came in, the morning light slanting across a desk, cluttered with case files. "She's trying to box me in again," Anthony said, dropping the printed notice on the desk. "If she gets that strip, she can bypass my gate completely." Tom read it over, then nodded slowly. "It's a clever move, I'll give her that. But it's not a done deal.
That land is county-owned for now, and it's earmarked for possible utility access. She'll have to jump through a lot of hoops to get it. We can slow her down, file an objection, request a review of the sale process, maybe even lobby the county to keep it public.
"Do it," Anthony said. "I'll pay whatever it costs."
Tom got to work immediately, but outside the legal arena, things were heating up fast. The local paper ran a front-page story, "Rancher Battles HOA Over Locked Gate." The article was fairly neutral, but the accompanying photo, Anthony leaning on the gate, arms crossed, gave the impression of a man standing his ground. The next morning at the feed store, people he barely knew came up to shake his hand. "Saw you in the paper," one older man said. "About time someone stood up to them." Not everyone was on his side. At the grocery store, a woman in an HOA volunteer badge muttered, "You're making this harder for all of us," as she passed him in the aisle. Anthony didn't bother responding. By the end of the week, the story had been picked up by a local talk radio show. Callers debated the situation for nearly an hour, some arguing property rights, others siding with the HOA's need for order. Anthony listened from his truck, surprised at how quickly his private battle had turned into a public one. Then came the community barbecue. It was an annual event at the town park, usually a chance for neighbors to relax and gossip over smoked brisket and sweet tea. This year, it felt more like a political rally. Clusters of people gathered under the shade trees, some openly wearing Ridley's right pins that Glenn had apparently handed out. Anthony kept to the edge, plate in hand, but he couldn't avoid Marjorie forever. She approached with two board members, her smile tight. "Mr. Ridley, enjoying the event?" "Not as much as I'd enjoy having my time back instead of dealing with all this," he replied evenly. Her smile didn't falter. "You've made your point, but the HOA will continue to enforce its rules. You'd be wise to consider the long-term consequences of this publicity." Anthony looked her dead in the eye. "You've been using fear to get your way for years. That stops now." The conversation drew the attention of those nearby. A few people stopped talking to watch. Marjorie noticed and shifted her tone, pretending to be consolatory. "We can still work this out without dragging it through the courts. You had that chance months ago. You chose the lock instead." She turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the concrete path. Later that night, Paula called him. "You know she's furious, right? She's lost control of the narrative. People aren't afraid to speak up anymore." Anthony leaned back in his chair. Good. Maybe that's the real win here. Still, he knew this wasn't over. Marjorie was too invested to walk away without trying something drastic. And sure enough, 2 days later, Tom called with news. Marjorie had filed a lawsuit challenging his ownership of the gate lot, claiming procedural irregularities in the sale process. But instead of feeling intimidated, Anthony felt something entirely else, a resolve that was stronger than it had been at any point in this fight. Now he wasn't just defending his land, he was defending every neighbor